Some crimes are terrifying because of the violence. But the cases you're about to hear are frightening for a different reason. In each of these stories, the killer didn't just try to hide what they had done, they inserted themselves directly into the aftermath. They stood beside grieving families, spoke to investigators, acted helpful, calm, even trustworthy, while secretly knowing far more than they should have. In one case, restaurants across an entire town unknowingly served food cooked with water contaminated by a decomposing body hidden inside a water tower. In another, a respected young shaman claimed to use supernatural visions to help police solve a murder, only for investigators to realize the visions were possible because he was the killer himself. And in the final story, a man confessed to murder after claiming he had been attacked by the ghost of the woman he killed. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 true crime cases where the most disturbing part wasn't just the murder itself, but the horrifying lengths the killers went to in order to cover their tracks. On the evening of the 5th of March, 1958, Kasim was sitting inside his home, quietly eating his dinner. The day had been like any other, filled with consultations and remedies. As darkness fell outside, he was just looking forward to a quiet night. But then a sudden, frantic pounding started at his front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the sound of desperation. Kasim wasn't expecting anyone, but this kind of thing wasn't entirely unusual. People in crisis didn't always make appointments. So he put down his food, got up from his table, and walked over to the door to see who needed him. When he opened it, he saw 4 men standing on his porch. Their faces were etched with worry. He recognized one of them vaguely, a man from town named Kaur. He'd seen him around, but they didn't know each other well. The other 3 men stood behind Kaur, looking just as anxious. Kaur stepped forward and introduced himself, his voice shaking a little. He explained that he needed Kasim's help. A terrible thing had happened. His wife had gone missing the night before. He said he had spent the entire day searching for her, calling out her name, checking with friends and family, but she was just gone. He was at his wit's end, and someone had suggested he come to the Bomo. He hoped, he pleaded, that maybe Kasim could use his spiritual gifts to help find her. Hearing this, Kasim felt a knot of apprehension in his stomach. He was confident in his abilities as a healer. He knew how to mix herbs, how to perform blessings, how to calm a troubled spirit. That was his world. But finding a missing person was something else entirely. He had never done anything like that before. He didn't want to give these desperate men false hope. So, Kasim was honest with them. He looked at Kaur and said he wasn't sure if he could help, that this was outside of his usual practice. But seeing the raw fear in the men's eyes, he knew he couldn't just turn them away. He told them he would try. With that, Kasim invited all 4 of them into his home. They shuffled into his small living room, which also served as his consultation space. As they took seats on the floor mats, Kasim went into a small back room where he kept his supplies. He returned a moment later carrying a large ceramic bowl filled with charcoal and a small box of matches. He placed the bowl in the center of the room and instructed everyone to sit in a circle around it. He explained what he was about to do. He told them he was going to perform a meditation ritual, one designed to clear his mind and open it up to the energies of the world around them. The goal, he said, was to try and connect with the energy of Kaur's missing wife. If he could find that connection, he might be able to sense where she was. The men nodded, their eyes fixed on him. The room fell silent, filled only with the heavy air of anticipation. Kasim took a match from the box, struck it against the side, and touched the flame to the charcoal. A small orange glow started in the center of the bowl and slowly began to spread, the coals beginning to smolder and release a thin tendril of smoke. Then, Kasim did something that made the other men watch in silent awe. He leaned his head directly over the smoldering bowl and began to take huge, deep breaths, inhaling the thick smoke. He held each breath for a long moment before slowly letting it out. He did this again and again, his eyes closed in deep concentration. The smoke filled his lungs, and he kept going until he felt lightheaded, until the room started to spin, and he felt like he was on the verge of passing out. And right at that moment, Just as he felt his consciousness beginning to slip away, an image flashed through his mind. It was incredibly brief, just a split second, but it was vivid. He saw a field, a vast expanse of light green that seemed to stretch on forever under a dark sky. It was just a field, nothing more, but the image was sharp and clear. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Kasim snapped his head back, gasping for fresh air, his lungs burning from the smoke. He looked at Kor and the other men, his eyes wide. He told them he had seen something. He knew where they needed to go. About 15 minutes later, the 5 men arrived at the edge of town. They stood before a huge, sprawling rice paddy bathed in the pale light of the moon. The young rice shoots gave the entire field a distinct, light green color. It was identical to the one Kasim had seen in his vision. Without a word, they fanned out and began to search. They moved slowly through the mud and water of the paddy, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of a person, any clue at all. The air was still and quiet. After just a few minutes of searching, one of the men suddenly called out. He had found something. Kasim, Kor, and the others hurried over to where the man was pointing. In the middle of the paddy, there was a large pile of straw. It looked completely out of place, like someone had deliberately gathered it and heaped it up. It was big enough to be covering something significant. Hesitantly, one of the men reached down and began pulling away the damp straw. As he removed the top layers, a shape began to emerge from underneath. And then they all saw it. It was Kor's wife. She was lying at the base of the pile, her clothes torn, her body covered in blood. Her eyes were lifeless. She was dead. Within the hour, the police had arrived and secured the scene. The lead officer was a man named J.C. Sabui. He was a practical, experienced policeman who had seen a lot in his years on the force. He listened patiently as Kor and his friends recounted the night's events, including the part about the Bomo and his vision. Sabui was, to put it mildly, skeptical of anything involving magic or visions. To him, it was far more likely that Kasim had simply heard a rumor or stumbled upon the body by chance and then created the vision story to make himself look important. But for now, that wasn't his primary concern. He had a murder to solve. The initial report from the scene was grim. The victim had been severely beaten to death. But there was another key detail. Sabui learned from Kor that his wife had been an avid collector of jewelry and always wore several rings, a necklace, and bracelets. When her body was found, however, all of her jewelry was gone. This immediately suggested a motive: robbery. It was a plausible theory, but Sabui knew better than to jump to conclusions. In cases like this, the husband was always the first person you looked at. So, about 30 minutes later, Sabui was sitting across from Kor in a small, bare interview room at the police station. Kor was still in shock, but he answered Sabui's questions. He told the officer that the night before, his wife had decided to go for a late-night walk by herself. He said it was something she did occasionally to clear her head. She had left the house and simply never came back. When Sabui asked if he knew anyone who would want to hurt her, Kor said no, but he immediately brought up the missing jewelry again. He seemed very insistent that it must have been a robbery, that someone must have attacked her for her valuables. Sabui listened, but he felt a sense of unease. The story about a spontaneous late-night walk felt a little thin. And Kor's eagerness to push the robbery theory felt a bit like he was trying to direct suspicion away from himself. Still, the missing jewelry was a hard fact. It was strong physical evidence that supported the robbery motive. So, Sabui decided to pursue both angles. He would keep a close eye on the husband, but he would also dedicate resources to finding the missing jewelry and tracking down any known thieves in the area. For the next 4 days, the investigation went nowhere. Sabui and his team worked around the clock. They searched the area around the rice paddy again and again, looking for a murder weapon or any other clues. They questioned local informants, trying to see if anyone had heard about a new stash of stolen jewelry being sold on the black market. They re-interviewed Kor, pressing him for more details about his marriage and his wife's habits. But they came up with absolutely nothing. Every lead was a dead end. The case had gone completely cold. Sabui was getting frustrated. The pressure from his superiors and the community was mounting. He felt like he was missing something obvious, but he couldn't figure out what it was. As he sat at his desk on the fourth day, staring at the case file, his mind kept drifting back to the one bizarre element of the whole story: the Bomo, Qasim. Sabui didn't believe in visions, not for a second. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Qasim's so-called vision had led them directly to the body. It was the only break they'd had in the entire case. He felt a bit foolish even considering it, but he was desperate. He had nothing else to go on. He decided that, as a last resort, it couldn't hurt to talk to the shaman one more time. On the morning of March 9th, 4 days after the body was found, Officer Sabui found himself knocking on Qasim's front door once again. When Qasim answered, Sabui explained the situation. He told him the investigation had stalled, that they believed the missing jewelry was the key to finding the killer, but they had no idea where it was. He asked Qasim, since he had been so helpful before, if he would be willing to try his ritual again. Maybe, just maybe, he could see something else that could help them. Qasim seemed reluctant. He told Sabui, just as he had told Kaur, that he was a spiritual healer, not a crime solver. He wasn't comfortable being so deeply involved in a police investigation. But he also acknowledged that he was already involved. His vision had led them to the body, and he felt a certain responsibility to see it through. He told Sabui that he would try. He couldn't promise anything, but he would try. So, for the second time in less than a week, Sabui watched as Qasim prepared his ritual. This time, it was just the two of them in the small living room. Qasim lit the bowl of charcoal and once again began to deeply inhale the fumes, his eyes closing as he entered his trance. Sabui watched, feeling a mix of skepticism and a tiny sliver of hope. After a minute or two of breathing in the smoke, Qasim's body went still. Then his eyes snapped open. He looked up at Sabui and said he'd had another vision. But this time, he didn't describe what he saw. He simply stood up, walked out of his house, and started walking down the street. He told Sabui to follow him. And so began a very strange journey. Sabui followed right behind Qasim as the young shaman walked through the town with a determined pace. It wasn't a random walk. Qasim would walk up to a house, stop in front of it, and just stare at it for a few moments as if he were trying to sense something inside. Then, without a word, he would shake his head and move on to the next house. They did this for what felt like an eternity. They looped through neighborhood after neighborhood, with Qasim stopping and staring at house after house. Hours began to pass. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Sabui's initial hope began to curdle back into his usual skepticism. This was a waste of time. He started to feel like a fool for even coming here. The first vision might have been a lucky guess, but this was clearly just a performance. This was going absolutely nowhere. He was just about to tell Qasim that this was enough, that they were done, when suddenly Qasim stopped again. He stood in front of yet another small, simple house, just like all the others. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. But this time, he didn't shake his head and move on. He slowly turned to face Sabui, and a look of absolute certainty was on his face. He pointed a finger at the house and said, "This is where the jewelry is." Sabui froze. A jolt went through him, a feeling of deep, chilling confusion. Because of all the houses in the entire town that he thought Qasim might stop in front of, this one had never even entered his mind as a possibility. It wasn't the home of a known criminal. It wasn't even the home of a distant relative of the victim. The house that Qasim had led him to, the house he claimed held the key to solving the entire murder, was Qasim's own house. In that single instant, everything shifted. Sabui's frustration and skepticism vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp suspicion. This was not a vision. This was not magic. This was something else entirely. It couldn't be a coincidence. He looked at Qasim, whose face was still a mask of calm confidence, and realized he was looking at his prime suspect. Sabui immediately called for backup. Within minutes, other officers arrived and they secured the house. Sabui then informed Kasim that they were going to conduct a search of his property. They searched the small house from top to bottom. They looked in every drawer, under every floorboard, in every container. And then, in a small wooden box tucked away in a back room, they found it. A collection of rings, bracelets, and a necklace. It was all of Kaur's wife's missing jewelry. Kasim's plan, whatever it had been, had just collapsed around him. The man who had presented himself as the key to the investigation had just led the police directly to the stolen evidence, which he had hidden in his own home. He was arrested on the spot. Later, at the station, Kasim gave a full confession. The story he told was a chilling departure from the image of the wise, gentle healer he had cultivated. He admitted that on the night of the murder, Kaur's wife had indeed gone for a walk by herself. By a fatal stroke of bad luck, her path had taken her right past Kasim's house. He had seen her, and he had seen the valuable jewelry she was wearing. In that moment, greed had taken over. He attacked her, killing her in the process, and stole her jewelry. Afterwards, he had concocted an elaborate and devious plan to cover his tracks. He took her body to the remote rice paddy and hid it under the pile of straw. He knew that when her husband, Kaur, grew desperate enough, he would likely come to the local Bomo for help. And that's exactly what happened. Kasim's plan was to discover the body through a mystical vision. This would make him look like a hero, a powerful spiritualist who was helping the community. It would place him completely above suspicion. Who would ever suspect the man who found the body? For a few days, his plan worked perfectly. But his arrogance was his downfall. When the police investigation stalled and they came back to him for more help, he saw another opportunity to reinforce his powers and control the narrative. He thought he could stage another dramatic vision that would lead them to the jewelry. Perhaps he intended to frame a neighbor, or perhaps he believed he could create a story so convincing that the police would think the real killer had planted the evidence in his home to set him up. But leading them on a long, winding tour of the town only to point to his own front door was a fatal miscalculation. The police didn't see a framed psychic. They saw a killer who had made a catastrophic mistake. Kasim bin Osman was tried and convicted of murder. His confession, combined with the discovery of the stolen jewelry in his house, left no room for doubt. He was sentenced to death. The aftermath sent a shockwave through the small town. The man they had trusted with their spiritual well-being, the person they looked to for guidance and healing, was a cold-blooded murderer. It was a betrayal that shook the community to its core, a dark reminder that evil can often wear the most convincing of masks. And in all three cases, the murderers thought they had come up with a perfect cover story. One person hid the body in a place where an entire town inadvertently consumed the evidence. Another pretends to help solve the very murder he committed. And a man became so terrified by what he had done that he eventually confessed to a dead woman whom he claimed had come back for revenge. Thank you for watching. If you liked today's episode, let me know which case made you feel the most uncomfortable. And if you want to hear more true crime stories where reality is stranger than fiction, there's a complete playlist waiting for you right now. See you in the next story. On the morning of the 12th of August, 2000, a huge fleet of 33 of Russia's most advanced naval warships gathered in a specific part of the Barents Sea. This sea is a massive 800-mile stretch of freezing, unforgiving water in the Arctic Circle, just northwest of Russia. These 33 ships weren't there by accident. They were there for a massive military training exercise. The plan was to run through a series of war game scenarios. For example, one ship would play the role of an enemy, and the other ships would practice locking onto it with their targeting systems and firing at it. But of course, they weren't using live ammunition. They were using dummy torpedoes and missiles, the kind that don't actually explode. Around 9 in the morning, the man in charge of this entire operation, Admiral Popov, gave the first command. He was on board one of the 33 ships overseeing everything. He authorized one of the submarines out there to shoot two of its dummy torpedoes at a designated target. The target was just one of the other ships pretending to be the enemy. As soon as he gave that order, the multi-day exercise officially began. All day and all through the night, these ships ran their drills, simulating combat and testing their systems. By the next morning, a full 24 hours into the exercise, Admiral Popov stepped away from the action for a bit. He had a scheduled call with some Russian reporters. During this interview, he told them that so far, the training exercise was going exactly to plan. He painted a picture of success, saying that it looked like it was going to be a huge achievement for the Russian Navy. But there was a problem. At the very same time that Admiral Popov was on the phone telling reporters how well everything was going, a rumor started to spread among the families of the crewmen who were out on the Barents Sea. The rumor was that the exercise was not going to plan at all. In fact, the word was that something terrible had happened to one of the ships. None of the family members had any concrete information. It was just a whisper, a feeling of dread that was passed from one person to another. But even though it was just a rumor, it was enough to cause serious worry. That morning, families began calling the naval base where the 33 ships had departed from, desperate for any information. At first, the phone operator at the base who was taking all these calls stuck to the official story. She told the frantic family members that no, nothing was wrong. She hadn't heard anything about any issues. But as the calls kept flooding in, the operator eventually let something slip. She admitted that she had also heard the rumor that something bad had happened, and she thought it might actually be true. One of the family members on the line heard this and immediately pressed the operator for more details. But at that point, the operator clammed up. She said she couldn't give out any more information and ended the conversation. So, the family member hung up the phone and did the next logical thing. They called the media. They told the reporters what was going on, about the rumor, and the operator's strange admission. As soon as the media had this story, they went straight back to Admiral Popov. They asked him directly if he could address the rumor, but he didn't. He gave no response to any of their questions. In a strange way, his silence was a little reassuring to some of the families. They figured that if Admiral Popov was just ignoring the rumor and staying out there on the Barents Sea, continuing with the exercise, then surely nothing truly bad could have happened. So, for the rest of that day, which was a Sunday, the families and the media just waited. There wasn't much else they could do. They had to wait for new information to come out of the exercise. The next day, on Monday the 14th, 48 hours after the training had started, there was finally news. Russian officials went on television to formally address the rumor. And they said, yes, it was true. Something had happened during the exercise. They explained that the Kursk, which was the name of one of the submarines participating in the drill, had experienced some minor technical difficulties. They said these difficulties had forced the submarine to ground itself on the bottom of the Barents Sea. But they quickly added that everyone should remain calm. This was a normal procedure, they said. They were in radio contact with the crew, everybody was fine, and they were already pumping air and power into the submarine. They assured the public that before long, they would have the Kursk back on the surface. There was absolutely nothing to worry about. Naturally, the family members of the Kursk's crew panicked when they heard this. Even though the government officials sounded completely confident, the families did not feel confident at all. Their loved ones were trapped at the bottom of the ocean. But at the same time, they tried to hold on to a glimmer of hope. They remembered that the Kursk was not just any submarine. It was a very special and supposedly very safe vessel. The Kursk was, quite literally, Russia's best ship. No expense had been spared in its construction. It was incredibly expensive and absolutely massive, bigger than 2 football fields put together. It was built out of a specialized, highly reinforced steel that was designed to allow it to take a direct hit from a torpedo and just keep going without any major problems. The inside was also outfitted with all the latest and greatest technology. So, the thinking was, if you had to be stuck at the bottom of the ocean inside a submarine, you would want to be stuck inside the Kursk. And the families took some small comfort in that. But over the next couple of days, that comfort began to fade. Despite the government's constant reassurances in the news that everything was fine, that it was a minor issue, and that they'd have the Kursk up in no time, the submarine was still at the bottom of the sea. And the government wasn't giving the families or the media any new information. In this vacuum of information, the families began to panic again, and the media started to speculate. Did the Kursk really just suffer from minor technical difficulties like the government was saying? Or was this something much, much more serious? That question would be answered on August 21st, 9 days after the training exercise had begun. A Norwegian dive team had been brought in to assist with the recovery effort. They were able to dive down to the Kursk's location. They managed to get inside the submarine through an escape hatch. An escape hatch is like a small, watertight closet on the outside of the sub that allows people to enter and exit without flooding the interior. Once these Norwegian divers got inside the Kursk and had a look around, they were completely shocked by what they saw. While the exact details of what happened inside the Kursk are still debated to this day, and probably will be for a long time, there is one part of the story that is more or less universally accepted. And that is what happened inside of compartment number 9. The Kursk was divided into 9 separate watertight segments called compartments. Compartment 1 was at the very front of the submarine, and they were numbered sequentially all the way to compartment 9 at the very back. The reason we know what happened inside compartment 9 is because a 27-year-old crew member named Dmitry Kolesnikov told us Dmitry was born into a family of submariners. His father was a submariner, and his grandfather was a submariner. Growing up, Dmitry idolized them, and all he ever wanted to do was follow in their footsteps. In the late 1990s, his dream came true. He was commissioned as a naval officer in the Russian Navy and was given orders to serve aboard the Kursk. Just 4 months before this fateful training exercise, Dmitry met and quickly married a high school teacher named Olga. Right after their wedding, one of the first things he did was bring her on board the Kursk for a personal tour. Olga brought a video camera with her and filmed the entire tour. On that video, Dmitry is all smiles. He's so happy leading her around the ship, introducing her to his crewmates, and showing her all the cramped spaces on board. It's incredibly obvious from the video that Dmitry was so proud of his job, and even more proud to be sharing that part of his life with his new wife. Fast forward to the 12th of August 2000. Dmitry, along with 117 other crew members, had just arrived at their designated location in the Barents Sea for the exercise. At 11:27 inches the morning, the captain of the Kursk came over the radio. He spoke to Admiral Popov, who was on a separate ship. The captain informed the admiral that the Kursk was about to fire its 2 dummy torpedoes. After that call was made, the crewmen in the first compartment of the Kursk, at the very front of the sub where the torpedoes were stored, began loading the 2 dummies into the tubes. Meanwhile, Dmitry was all the way back in the 7th compartment. This was the engine room, and it was where he was stationed. In fact, he was the officer in charge of everyone who worked in compartment 7. So, as the 2 dummy torpedoes were being loaded up front, Dmitry and his men were at their posts, twisting dials and pulling levers, running through their checks. All of a sudden, there was a really loud crashing sound. Then the entire ship shuddered violently and jolted hard to one side, as if a giant hand had grabbed the front of the submarine and twisted it. What Dmitry and the men in the 7th compartment couldn't possibly have known was that one of the real live torpedoes in the first compartment had malfunctioned. and it had just exploded. But because of how well built the Kursk was, how strong its reinforced hull was, the torpedo explosion, just as advertised, did not puncture through the outer wall. It did cause a lot of damage and started a massive fire, but the sub was not yet sinking. Back in the 7th compartment, Dmitri picked himself up from the floor. Alarms were blaring, and everything was total chaos. Everyone was shouting, asking what was going on. Dmitri took charge. He ordered his men to follow their emergency protocol, which was to seal the watertight doors of their compartment. In this case, he sealed the door leading to the 6th compartment in front of them and the door leading to the 8th compartment behind them. There are a lot of reasons for this protocol, but the main one is to contain damage. If there's a leak somewhere else on the submarine, sealing off your compartment protects you from being flooded. As Dmitri and his men were turning the heavy wheels to seal the 2 doors, they would have started to see and smell smoke pouring in through the ventilation ducts. This smoke was coming from the uncontrolled fire that was now raging at the front of the submarine. They also would have felt the submarine suddenly pitch upward at a very steep angle. The captain of the Kursk was desperately trying to surface. But before they could reach the surface, that uncontained fire reached the other live torpedoes, and it set off an almost instantaneous chain reaction of explosions. This second collective blast was catastrophic. It killed virtually everyone in the front half of the submarine. Either the blast itself blew them apart, or they died moments later when the hull was finally breached. This second explosion was so powerful that it did puncture the walls of the sub, creating a huge hole in the front. Icy Arctic water began flooding in at an incredible rate. So if you weren't killed by the blast, you very quickly drowned. The only people who survived the first and second explosions were those in the 6th compartment and further back. So compartments 6, 7, 8, and 9. Dmitri and the other men in the 7th compartment would have been badly shaken up by that second explosion. It would have rocked the submarine and sent them tumbling all over the place. But they were still alive, and they were very aware of the terrible situation they were in. I would imagine that Dmitri and the others tried to grab onto any piping or equipment they could as the submarine, its control room now destroyed, just angled straight down and began to plummet towards the ocean floor. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after that initial explosion, the Kursk slammed nose first into the seabed 350 feet below the surface. And then the back half of the submarine settled down to rest. We don't know exactly what happened on board the Kursk for the first 2 hours after it hit the bottom. What we do know is that they had power. So there was light inside the submarine. Also, the air purifiers were still working, so despite all the chemicals and smoke in the air, it was relatively easy to breathe. We also know that at some point, Dmitri and the other men in his compartment must have heard banging coming from the 6th compartment. Remember, they had sealed off the doors to both the 8th and the 6th compartments. Hearing the banging, Dmitri made a decision. He decided to break emergency protocol. He opened the door to the 6th compartment to allow any survivors who were banging on it to come into their section. When Dmitri and his men opened that door and looked into the 6th compartment, they would have seen that it was rapidly flooding. It was also clear that most likely anybody forward of that compartment in 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1 was already dead. By 1:30 p.m., Dmitri and his men in the 7th compartment, along with the other survivors from the 6th, were forced to retreat. They moved from the 7th compartment into the 8th, and then finally into the 9th compartment at the very back of the submarine. The flooding was getting worse. Even though they had sealed off their watertight doors, the walls themselves were no longer watertight. The huge explosion had sent shrapnel flying down the body of the submarine, puncturing holes in all the walls between the compartments. So it didn't matter if you shut your watertight door, Eventually, as one compartment filled up, the water would begin leaking through all the cracks and holes in the walls. Dmitri and all the men with him would have been very aware of this. By the time they all got back to the ninth compartment, there was nowhere else to go. The water was going to eventually reach them. They were doomed, unless they were rescued or unless they could get out through the escape hatch. Despite how absolutely terrifying this situation must have been, Dmitri remained calm. In fact, he was so calm that he pulled out a piece of paper. As he's sitting there in this cramped ninth compartment with 22 other men, he writes the date and the time in the corner. Then he begins to describe what had happened. He writes about an explosion and that he thought he and these 22 other men were the only survivors. He says they are now trapped in the ninth compartment and they have to wait for rescue. He also mentions that they had considered using the escape hatch, but apparently it hadn't worked. After Dmitri wrote this very neat, very legible, and very organized note, he folded it up and put it in his pocket. Then, for the next hour and a half, he sat there inside the ninth compartment with the 22 others. And then, the power went out. This plunged them into absolute pitch-black darkness. I mean, completely black inside of there. And because the power was out, the temperatures suddenly began to plummet. Then, the worst part, the water began seeping through the walls much faster. Dmitri and the other men would have known then that it was just a matter of time before the room filled completely with water. And there was nowhere to go. So, with the water rising all around them in the dark, Dmitri pulled that piece of paper back out of his pocket, and he added to the note, but this time his handwriting is barely legible. It's because he was probably suffering from hypothermia, so he would have been shaking uncontrollably. He also couldn't see what he was writing. In fact, he writes the words, "I'm writing blind," to indicate that it's totally dark in the room. In this second part of the note, which was dated and time-stamped an hour and a half after the first one, Dmitri indicates that he does not think he's going to survive. It's very clear that none of them think they're going to make it. Then, with the remaining space on the piece of paper, Dmitri writes a very loving and thoughtful message to his wife and his family, saying goodbye. And then his final words on the note are, "Regards to everybody. No need to despair. Kolesnikov." After he wrote this second message, he folded the paper up, put it back in his breast pocket, and then, in total darkness, listening to the sound of water rushing into the room, he and the other 22 damned souls prepared to die. We don't know exactly how long Dmitri and the other 22 men survived in compartment 9. But experts say the entire Kursk submarine was completely flooded about 8 hours after the initial explosion. One of the most heartbreaking parts of this whole story is that Dmitri and those 22 other men could have potentially been saved if the Russian response had been a little more urgent and coordinated. Despite 2 of the other ships in the exercise, including the ship that Admiral Popov was on, hearing and feeling the second massive explosion from the Kursk, nothing was done about it. It was reported, but no one really took any action. And then, when no one could get in touch with the Kursk after they had said they were going to fire their dummy torpedoes, everyone just assumed it was a radio problem. They figured the Kursk was fine and would be in touch soon. So it wasn't until later that evening that the Russian Navy even figured out there was a major problem, that the Kursk had effectively vanished. And then it would be several more hours before they even got a rescue submersible into the water and down to the Kursk's location. Once it was down there, the Russian rescue sub could not latch onto the escape hatch on the submarine. So even if there were survivors inside, they would not have been able to get out. For days, the Russians struggled to get inside the submarine and kept turning down offers of foreign aid from Norway, from America, and from Great Britain. Then finally, 9 days after the Kursk had sunk, the Russians accepted foreign aid. That's when the Norwegian dive team went down. They were able to open up the escape hatch relatively quickly. When they went inside the submarine, they saw it was completely flooded. There were bodies floating everywhere. And that's when, ultimately, Dmitri's body was found. and they found that note tucked safely in his breast pocket. Russia would go on to award the entire crew of the Kursk with the Order of Courage, which is a very significant military award. The families of the crew were each given 10 years' salary. They were also given free housing in any Russian city of their choice, and their children would all have their college educations paid for. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, an 18-year-old college student named Michael Perry found himself 1,000 feet underground inside one of America's most dangerous cave systems. He was crouched low inside a vast, dark cavern in Lafayette, Georgia, surrounded by 4 of his friends. As Michael shifted his weight, the beam from his headlamp danced across the cave walls, catching slick rock formations dripping with moisture. The light briefly illuminated underground waterfalls cascading through the darkness before vanishing into deep black crevices that seemed to have no bottom. The entire place felt alien, cold, and completely cut off from the sunny world above. And before that day was over, 2 people inside that cave would be dead. The cave they were exploring was called Ellison Cave. Michael and his friends had driven more than 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville, Florida, just to see it. Ellison was famous among experienced cavers. It was a sprawling underground maze filled with narrow tunnels, massive vertical drops, freezing waterfalls, and pitch-black chambers that could turn deadly in an instant if something went wrong. Every year, adventurers from all over the country traveled there looking for excitement. But, to be perfectly clear, this kind of activity, caving, it was not really Michael's thing. Not at all. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida. If you asked him to describe himself, he would have said he was a pretty quiet person. He enjoyed studying, he liked playing in his school's band, and he dedicated a lot of his time to volunteering with his church youth group. So the idea of crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, intensely claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet beneath the Earth's surface, that did not rank high on his list of fun things to do. In fact, it probably wasn't on the list at all. But Michael wasn't in Ellison Cave that day for fun. He was there for a very specific reason, and that reason was his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach. Grant had been the one to suggest the trip. He was passionate about it, and when Grant got an idea in his head, he was very persuasive. So Michael, being a good friend, had simply said, "Okay, I'll go with you." Just then, Michael glanced over to where Grant was sitting. He was with his girlfriend, a young woman named Carrie, and their 2 other friends were there as well. The group of them were huddled together, looking through a large backpack. They were taking inventory, checking over the various pieces of specialized gear they had brought along with them for the expedition. They had only entered Ellison Cave a few minutes ago, but they had already stopped. The group had paused their progress because there was something in this specific area of the cave that Grant was absolutely determined to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it almost always happened. That was just the kind of person he was. It's why Michael, despite his reservations, had capitulated and ended up deep inside this mountain. Grant wanted him to come, and so, like he normally did, Michael went along with it. Grant was a natural leader. He was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a group that Michael, Carrie, and the other 2 friends were also devoted members of. When Michael had first joined the fellowship, Grant had immediately taken him under his wing. He saw something in Michael. He told him that he had tons of potential. In fact, Grant had said that Michael had enough potential to one day become the next president of the fellowship himself. Hearing this from Grant had been a huge deal for Michael. It gave him a massive boost of confidence because he really truly looked up to Grant. And he wasn't alone in that. A lot of people did. Grant was just one of those effortlessly cool guys. He was a few years older than Michael, stood about 6 feet tall, and was basically a walking, talking ball of positive energy. He was always on the lookout for the next adventure, the next challenge to conquer. Caving was one of those adventures. Grant had been exploring caves as a serious hobby for the past 3 years, and out of everyone in their group that day, he was the only one with any real practical caving experience. And it was precisely because of this lack of experience among the others, Michael included, that Grant had chosen an easier route for them. They were navigating a tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain. It was a beginner's trail. It didn't require much in the way of technical gear, like ropes or complex climbing equipment. But despite the low level of difficulty for their chosen path, they had brought all of that extra equipment anyway. They had ropes and harnesses and carabiners. They had it all. And that was because along this easier route, right at the spot where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a massive vertical shaft. And Grant specifically wanted to climb down into it, even if he had to go alone. This particular shaft was 125 feet deep. To put that in perspective, imagine a 10-story building. That's how far this pit dropped straight down into the earth. But in the world of serious caving, this was actually considered a small one. It was officially called the warm-up pit, because compared to the other, much deeper pits inside Ellison Cave, it was nothing. Some of the other vertical drops in the cave were way, way deeper, some over 500 feet. So while this was definitely not a beginner's task, for an experienced caver like Grant, it was a manageable, almost routine challenge. Michael watched as Grant picked up the backpack, the one with all the equipment inside, and carried it over to the entrance of the pit. The entrance was just a very large, dark hole in the cave floor. It was situated over near a noisy waterfall, and it was only a few feet away from where Michael was standing. So Michael walked over to Grant to offer his help. He wanted to assist him in setting up the gear for his descent. The process involved attaching a long climbing rope securely to the rocks around the pit's edge, creating an anchor that Grant could then use to lower himself safely into the darkness below. This whole setup process is called rigging. It took them a while to get it all done. Michael, again, had no experience with any of this, so he had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every single step. He would hold a rope here, check a knot there, all under Grant's careful direction. But as Michael worked alongside his friend, he found himself peering down into that pitch-black hole. As he looked down into what felt like a bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach do a little flip. He was suddenly very, very glad that he had not promised Grant he would go down into the pit with him. Because seeing it now, up close and in person, it was terrifying. He wanted no part of going down into that thing. But Grant clearly did. His eyes were bright with excitement. He was in his element. So Michael and Grant continued the process of getting Grant all set up. And then, eventually, when Grant was fully rigged and ready to go, Michael heard a strange sound. It was the sound of something heavy sliding off a rock. And then, just moments later, that sound was followed by a loud, echoing thud that seemed to come from deep, deep inside the hole, from the bottom of the warm-up pit. For a brief moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what he had just heard. Maybe it was just a loose rock that had tumbled into the pit. But then he looked over at Grant. Grant had a very unhappy expression on his face, and he was staring at the ground right next to the edge of the pit. He was looking at the spot where their backpack had been sitting just a second ago. The backpack with all of their extra equipment inside? At least, the equipment they weren't currently using. And the backpack was no longer there. It was gone. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet straight down into the pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. The last thing they wanted was for their backpack to be at the bottom of that hole. But it was actually much worse than just potentially losing some of their equipment. Because inside of that bag was the only cell phone they had brought with them into the cave. And it was also where they had stored all of their extra ropes and other essential climbing gear. They had taken some things out, of course, to get Grant rigged up for his descent, but losing that bag felt really, really bad. Without the contents of that backpack, they could easily get stranded or trapped deep inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anyone for help. They would be completely stuck. And so Michael could feel a wave of panic starting to wash over him. But then Grant cut in. He played it cool, as he always did. He just looked at the group and said, "Look, it's no big deal." He would just go down there and get it. I mean, he was already planning on going into the hole anyway, and he was all rigged up and ready to go after all. So he would simply go down, retrieve the bag, and come back up. It would be fine. And then, before Michael or Grant's girlfriend, Carrie, or any of the other friends could say a word, Grant just strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders. Ascenders are climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled, measured way. He began positioning himself at the edge of the pit, preparing to go down. Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident, so in control, that he was able to make everyone else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt his own panic starting to subside just from watching Grant's unshakable demeanor. This wasn't the first time Grant had projected such calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year of college, he had casually climbed up the entire exterior of one of their school's tallest dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did. He had also joined the school's ROTC program, which is a military reserve training program, and as part of that, he had learned how to jump out of airplanes. So he had skydived, another one of his thrill-seeking activities. This moment here in the cave seemed like yet another perfect example of why Grant was such an incredible and natural leader. And as Michael watched him, he found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, he could be just as fearless, just as composed as Grant. But for now, Michael just watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole. And then he disappeared into the abyss below. For the next few minutes, it was very quiet in the cavern. All Michael could hear was the constant rushing sound of the nearby waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just talked quietly amongst themselves. They waited for Grant to call back up to let them know that he had made it to the bottom and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant's voice. He did call out from somewhere deep down in that hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying. The waterfall that was blasting away nearby was really loud, and it created a lot of noise. And on top of that, Grant's voice echoed strangely around the stone walls of the cave, which made it almost impossible to tell what he was trying to say. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others, they weren't worried yet. They just figured this was an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of the pit, and he leaned over carefully, trying to look down. But it was no use. He couldn't see Grant. He was too far down, and it was far too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself, explaining that they couldn't understand what he was saying from up there. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael's call. But Michael still couldn't really make out the words. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he didn't know what Grant was saying, one thing was suddenly definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really, really fast. He was repeating himself. He was saying something over and over again very, very quickly with a sense of extreme urgency. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what the words were, the tone was unmistakable. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems can and do arise when you're rappelling into a 125-foot hole deep underground inside a cave. That can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they finally processed that something was seriously wrong for Grant, it was truly shocking. I mean, Grant is the guy that gets other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing ever rattled him. And so to hear him basically panicking, it was deeply unsettling for those of them standing at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden dual realization. One, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way. But worse, two, is the fact that they are not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they completely lacked the experience, but also because all the caving gear, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that had fallen into the pit. It was down there with Grant. So there was no way they could realistically help him if he was in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one and only cell phone was down there in that backpack in the pit as well. And so, unless Grant could somehow figure out whatever problem he was having and get himself back up to the surface on his own, Michael and the others knew, without even having to say it out loud, that they were completely and utterly helpless. And so, as this grim realization is setting in for Michael and the other friends, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds panicked, to straight up screaming. He is screaming for them. Something is horribly, horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying desperately to get him to clarify what's going on. But you have this powerful waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing water everywhere. It's dark. And Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them anymore. And so it's just chaos. It's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends that are with them. And they tell them, look, we're going to stay right here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two need to leave the cave right now. Go get help. And so the other two friends, they rushed off to do just that, disappearing back into the darkness of the tunnel. While Michael and Carrie just sat there by the edge of the pit, listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere far down in that black hole, they still had no idea what was wrong. But clearly, there was a major emergency happening. And so, for a little while after their friends had gone off to find help, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really having a conversation with Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming and they still can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole. They're yelling things like, everything's going to be okay. We've sent for help. It's going to be okay. You're going to get out of here soon. They had no idea if he could even hear them or understand what they were saying. They were just assuming that the acoustics were just as bad for him down there as they were for them up here. Again, the sound of that waterfall was so incredibly loud. It was so dark. And so they're just having this awful, helpless moment. But then something cut through all of that chaos. At some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. It was like he was directly yelling to Michael a clear and desperate plea. I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously, the situation has escalated dramatically. Things were already bad, but for Michael, this felt like a huge deal. I mean, before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously terrible, but Michael, he kind of views himself as Grant's potential successor. He's going to be the next president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was this fearless, capable leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his own name called out so clearly that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him. You, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility in that instant. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait for help to arrive. Something needs to be done right now, and I need to be the one to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up and he grabbed the extra harness they still had with them and he started to put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. What are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, who is still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over to the edge of the pit and he attached his harness to the very same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to somewhere down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason. And into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared down into that hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit. She put her hands together, and she prayed as hard as she possibly could for both Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying. He called out that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie. And as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in her body, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her system because now she's thinking everything is okay, she also realized that she, too, was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it before. She had been so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also of Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt, and the cave was very damp, and there's this waterfall constantly spraying a mist of cold water everywhere. It was a cold, damp environment. And so she's, her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine. I'm fine. But he didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell that clearly there is something really wrong down there, and it probably has something to do with Grant. And so she stood up. She began pacing back and forth anxiously. Her stomach is in knots. And she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. I'm fine. He would just repeat that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, occasionally yell out, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. But the responses just began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more, what's going on? Until finally, Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so, the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around the edge of the pit, yelling out to Michael and Grant. But the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cold cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into Ellison Cave, carrying a large bag filled with climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of professional rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them. That team had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving much more slowly. It takes time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there are a lot of people and a lot of specialized equipment that is required. And also, usually, the victims are trapped in pretty remote and difficult to access places, like deep tunnels and narrow shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his 2-man team were the initial smaller group that went in ahead of the larger one, just to kind of get the rescue started as quickly as possible. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around erratically. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman. She was sitting by a large hole in the ground, and she was shaking and absolutely terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole. She told him that Grant had gone in first, there had been some kind of issue, and then Michael had gone in after him to help. And now, when she called out for them, neither one of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her safely out of the cave. And then, once they had left, Anmar put on his own climbing gear. And as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into the pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft. And at first, he can't see anything at all. But after a little while, he began to see, somewhere far down below, what appeared to be 2 small lights towards the bottom of the pit, which he correctly assumed belonged to the 2 missing men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash against his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness, right below him. It would turn out, when Grant had rappelled down into the warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rigging, his main rope, to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful and you move quickly. Except what happened with Grant is, as he was rappelling literally through the flowing water, like the water is coming off this waterfall and it's hitting him directly, he got stuck. His rope got tangled, and the spot where he got stuck was literally in the direct path of the waterfall. So, he's stuck in the cave. He can't go up. He can't go down. And he's just getting pounded by a constant stream of freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around trying desperately to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this narrow vertical shaft. There's nowhere to move, and he's just dangling there. And he began trying to scream out for help. But that was why his words were so muffled. The water was hitting him in the face, making it impossible for him to speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there very, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have sent his body into shock. It's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or even think anymore. He was rapidly becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. He said it really clearly. He must have managed to get his face out of the direct path of the water for just a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely, when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his personal calling. He felt he needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so, into the hole he went. And he hooked his own rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had used. And down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached the spot where Grant was, but he got stuck as well. Also, in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was. Like his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie at least for a little while. But he also got tangled at the same spot. He couldn't move. His body was getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two young men had frozen to death. They had basically dangled inside of that hole, getting hit by that freezing water for about 2 hours before their bodies just completely shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his own life in an attempt to save Grant's. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his remote Washington State lodge. He had a glass of whiskey and Coke in his hand, and he turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. Just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume on the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore. A couple of his cats were fighting in the other room, yowling and hissing, and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had living with him, but it was a lot. Maybe a dozen or so. And even though at this particular moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him. He liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's beloved wife Edna had died. And ever since then, he had lived completely alone, minus all of these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors to speak of either. So, for the most part, he had been fairly isolated for the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the beautiful lake that his lodge was situated on, was a 4-hour drive south of the major city of Seattle. It was pretty far out there, deep in the wilderness. The lake did get busy during the summer months with tourists and campers, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there year-round, and they were all very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, of course, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and he had the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and the lake right outside his door. And he had his whiskey and cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff, cantankerous guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's front door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lived way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not normally expect visitors, but in this case, he knew exactly who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a deep scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really only had one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him. And that was the government. For the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door right now, had been harassing him. They were trying to get him to leave his lodge, to abandon the home in the wilderness that he loved so much. They said they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation, and they wanted everybody in the area to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country. He had even fought for it during the First World War. But he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law completely and made his own booze. He just didn't care about their rules. So, over these last few days, as these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated in the slightest. He had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in the hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, and certainly not with local police. Not with his own family, not with his friends, and not with the 2 ex-wives he'd been with before he found Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. Always. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were. And not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy, a man that Harry did know. He was clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try one more time to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door, even after the deputy had clearly announced himself knowing that Harry would recognize his voice, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him, "You've got to leave." The deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision for himself. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad. Because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years. And 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little bit after she had died. So truthfully, it was kind of falling apart, and it smelled terrible because of all the cats. But it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete and total understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this whole area, was his religion. And he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever else told him to. So, all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside his door was a very firm good night, which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So, this seemed pretty mild for him. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his police cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself. He picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground. And at the same time, he was sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, the officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house. He had his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a fresh glass of whiskey sitting in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house that he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreen trees, but it also had a great view of the mountains and the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert, because the woods all around him were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also down near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them, because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and had left when they were told to. Which meant that Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, the officials had not physically attempted to force him out of his home, but now that Harry saw them all assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities. And that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's stubborn refusal to leave his wilderness home, just because the government told him to, had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on, and they had started coming all the way out to his house to talk to him. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always just looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really, really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by all these outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to have any chance of staying in his home. Because the way he saw it was, the government could not really make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So, over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single, older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful than himself, which was sort of admirable. Although people didn't really understand why he was doing it, it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house. He famously said, "No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. Damn right this is my home. They're going to have to come and get me. No authority could take me out of here. No authority dare." And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he bottled and distilled himself during his prohibition days, which he called panthropy, and about his relationship with his late wife Edna and how they used to dance together right at the edge of the lake. Or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so, by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this was 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry Truman, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail. Reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest with himself, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been perfectly happy with his quiet life. He had no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it was like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks. Because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong, and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. The sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, at 8:32 in the morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights as a citizen. They were trying to save his life. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, the land that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated and urgent warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing hot lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and all of his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So, in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loved so much. And in both of today's stories, the people at the center of them made choices they believed were the right ones. Grant believed he could handle the cave. Michael believed he could save his friend. Harry believed the mountain he loved would never harm him. But sometimes, confidence, loyalty, and even love can push people toward decisions they never fully realize are dangerous until it's far too late. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know which story stayed with you the most in the comments below. And if you want more true stories about strange disasters, impossible decisions, and people who found themselves in situations far beyond their control, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, see ya.